just take a quick peek at the way it looks in your chart. Okay, I'm going to, of course, move this out of our way. In fact, if you want, you could even delete the indicator. So if I'm taking a look at now the pivots, all right, and I'm going to go ahead and just move this Euro US dollar we're looking at to a 1 hour chart. And you know what? I'm going to go ahead and change the background as well. Let's go ahead and do this. Right click your chart, go to properties, drop down the menu on the colors tab, and I can do something like a black on white. Okay? Change the color scheme just that quickly. So when it comes to pivots, you know, I got to tell you, when it comes to pivots, it's an interesting discussion, okay? Because pivots are one of those tools that I think are very psychologically relevant because they are so simple to use, so readily available, and because of their simplicity to use, they've become popular. Realize there's a lot of great analysis out there, but if it's very complex, there's a lot of subjectivity, and therefore it won't necessarily be as well followed. Pivots are one of those things that, give or take, you're going to see very similar R2, R1, pivot, S1, S2 type readings, regardless of the kind of tool you use and regardless of where you're getting the information. But I will tell you that for me, having the lines just plotted right on my charts, on my intraday charts most especially, gives me an idea not only of psychologically relevant support and resistance, but also of sentiment. Now, I'm not going to get into how to calculate them because we can get into, you know, the P plus H minus L. Honestly, this is the plugin's doing the work for me. If you're curious about the calculations, you can go ahead and email me, raghee.horner@ibfx.com, and I'll be happy to send you over the calculations. But let's not delve into the minutiae here. Let's talk about what we're doing in terms of the support and resistance that pivots provide us. First of all, the most important level within the 7 that you see here is going to be the pivot itself. Okay? These are basically levels that are valid for a single session, okay, because they utilize the basically the high-low close of the previous session to plot. Okay, so basically they're very simple to calculate because as long as the high-low close can be agreed upon, you're going to end up with a very similar calculation no matter who does it. But that's where the problem arises, because how do you have a high-low close in a market that technically doesn't close, right? You know, coming from a futures background like I did, and also the stocks, there was an accepted exchange mandated open and close. We don't have that necessarily in the Forex market, right? So we're going to have to basically impose a close on it. Most tools will utilize GMT. Okay? Most of them will go ahead and utilize GMT, which is fine because it then reflects really the activity of London, which I think is most pertinent, and that's fine. One of the things we're working on, by the way, and no guarantees, but it's something that I've actually requested, is the ability to actually have a session start and stop time built into the pivot. Because that way you can actually be 100% positive it's reflecting the session that you want it to reflect, and have the open, have the high-low close do that. In fact, when I used to calculate this manually, I would use a 2 a.m. Eastern Standard Time open to a noon Eastern Standard Time close, basically reflecting essentially the Frankfurt open and essentially the London close. Noon on the East Coast, where I live in Florida, is basically 5 p.m. in London. So that's what I would utilize, focusing on that London, and that London session with some of Frankfurt mixed in there. So that's something that's probably won't be tomorrow, but I'll definitely let you know. Hopefully maybe by the end of our series here, so we can utilize it in our big Saturday webinar here together. Every one of these levels is support and resistance. My advice to you, though, is if there can be another reason these levels are relevant. Obviously, people are going to be watching this because there's a certain amount of self-fulfilling prophecy, as we talked about before, a certain amount of popularity, and therefore there will be some adherence to R1 at 37.05 being resistance. But let me add this. If you have a psychological level like a 00, a 50 pip, I said those are major psychological levels, or a minor psych level like a 20 or an 80 pip that also coincides or is very nearby one of these resistance, support, or even the pivot point itself, you've got a secondary psychological reason for that level to be a floor or a ceiling. Okay? So that's something to keep in mind. So I'm always looking for multiple reasons why a certain price level might be pertinent. And that's when you start putting together tools like the pivots and the CPR, the candlestick pattern recognition, and you, for example, might end up with a candlestick pattern reversal at one of these key levels. That is terrific secondary confirmation. You have two tools recognizing a particular decision level, and when they form at a similar area around that level, you've got terrific secondary technical indicator-based confirmation. Okay? Obviously, there's no guarantee that a particular level will be 100% support or resistance, or will absolutely be a floor or ceiling. There's no way to predict that or guarantee that, obviously. But what we're trying to do is narrow down the possibilities for where the market might actually reverse, or where the market might actually stall, or a price level the market might actually recognize as more important than another. You know, there's so many, really, with price action just dictating multiple support and resistance levels on any time frame, how do you narrow it down? You know, obviously, this level here, the R3, the R2, the R1, any one of these could have been resistance. And you can notice for a short time, here was R1 acting as resistance. This is a 1 hour Euro-US dollar chart. You move up higher, the R2 really wasn't that well recognized. We looked for possible resistance, but it really wasn't recognized. You get to R3, and even though we shot up through it, take a look now. The R3 is really excellent resistance right now. Okay? So don't expect prices to necessarily stop or reverse or stall there, but this is a suggested level of resistance. The pivot, like I mentioned earlier, is the most psychologically significant because, generally speaking, the market at large will determine or will feel that a market is bullish when it's above its pivot and bearish when it's below it. So if you see a market go below its pivot for the first time in the day, there is a bearish sentiment that will accompany that. If you see price action break up higher through the pivot point for the first time of the day, again, there is a bullish sentiment that will accompany that from a large segment of the trading population of the market participants. Again, it's no guarantee, okay, but there is a large segment of that trading population, that investing population, that will see that shift of price up through a pivot or down through a pivot as bullish or, again, below bearish. So it's really important to see where we are in relation to the pivot on any of the time frames, because there is a certain amount of opinion that accompanies that. Okay, and again, why does it work? Because so many people are watching it. And I believe, my opinion, the reason so many people are watching it is it's one of those studies that's very easy to automate, or it's very easy to calculate on by yourself. There's very little subjectivity. I think the most subjective thing about the pivots is, well, there are actually several different methods for calculating pivot points. The most common is the 5-point system, okay, which is, I believe, what this one uses. And therefore, the only subjectivity is the start and stop time, the closing time, the open and close time. Okay. All right, so that is pivots. Now, we're going to move on to the CPR here, and while we move on to CPR, I know some of you might be very familiar with candlesticks, and some of you may not be so familiar with candlesticks. What I'm going to do is go ahead and discuss the candlestick patterns that the CPR recognizes. Take a quick look at the CPR. Oh, by the way, weekly pivots. I apply weekly pivots to typically a daily chart. It's not something I personally use a lot, but it's the same idea. okay? And you do have the IBFX weekly pivots. I prefer the daily. I don't find weeklies are as well followed, but certainly if you apply them to a daily, there is going to be some psychology to a daily, obviously, moving below or above its weekly pivot level. So that's certainly something you can apply to a daily chart. Okay, so candlestick, CPR. Love this indicator.